So we now pick up then discussing the impact of the Cold War on from the previous slide, and just to briefly talk about um, some of how that is represented in popular culture. And I've chosen two examples here to sort of illustrate that. But ultimately, there is this idea of escapism, which becomes quite a prominent theme. When the world is so bleak, you can look at other ways. And so it's no coincidence that, to take the image on the right here, you have very popular cartoons like the Jetsons, in which a kind of archetypal 1950s family setup, husband, wife, children, dog, is set up is shown living in a sort of space city of the future, um, with all these sort of glamorous features that don't look so different to 1950s American life. And as you think about the illustration of the American car earlier, you can see how that, with its fins and so on, and its bubble canopy, is not so different to the kind of science fiction depictions of spaceships at the time. This idea of living in a world, or rather outside of this world, that we have done such a good job of destroying. Now, in terms of the image on the left here, you might recognise this as being from Lord of the Rings, which again was published, I think, in the 1960s. Now, what you're looking at here might not seem like much of an image of escapism. This, of course, is Mordor, the sort of evil land that's depicted in that. Now, it's been argued that this idea of the ring was inspired by atomic bombs and things like that. This idea of a terrible and dangerous weapon. Um, but the important thing about Lord of the Rings is the fact that good triumphs. And if you think about the world that for example, the hobbits come from, Hobbiton and Middle Earth, the Shire and so on, what it looks like is a kind of pastoral, idealized vision of the countryside. In other words, what it seems like is that you have this idealized vision of the country to protect against these forces of evil, and the fact that that's shown as being successful is a key part of the appeal. Having said that, while there was an interest in these escapist things, there was also very much a taste for more realist content that really engaged with the difficulties at the time. But this is certainly a particularly prominent feature from that time. So, to move on then, we've mentioned about engagement. You see that in literature, but what you also see is a rise of protest movements in society. The image on the left here is nuclear protests. That symbol that gentleman has on his shoulder is, of course, the symbol of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, or CND. On the right, there you have British protesters about the war in Vietnam, which of course Britain never joined. It was the Americans really fought that one largely on their own. But you have this sort of rising tradition of popular protest against unpopular actions by government. It's not to say, obviously, that protests hadn't existed previously, but the fact that they become more and more sort of noticeable, engaging with these contemporary social issues of the day, worth bearing in mind again. Now, there's an interesting point about our attitudes to war throughout this period, because you see from the picture on the left the way in which the Second World War literally becomes a part of everyday life. You know, that great symbol of Britain, a red telephone box entombed in sandbags. But of course, in that, there's very much what is now suggested to be a total war, a war that involves soldiers at the front, that involves the whole population, huge number of factories going over to war production, and so on and so on, bombings of civilians. But actually, by the end of this period, we have an entirely different conception of war. War is now something that happens many thousands of miles away on the other side of the globe, for example. And if you think about things like the wars in Afghanistan, for example, which is probably the most significant conflict of the last sort of 20 years, this idea that there were more casualties on D-Day than in the entirety of the Afghan war, 4,500 to 3,500. We also now have this idea that war should be somehow almost more bloodless. The idea of physical violence and suffering shocks us more. And I think largely throughout this period, I think a kind of an increasing distaste for war can generally be identified as a trend. The one real exception to that, which is illustrated by the picture at the bottom here, is the war in the Falklands in 1983, where an Argentine force invaded one of the few remaining British colonial outposts, the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. And we actually dispatched a task force which attacked the occupying enemy and drove it back. And this picture here illustrates the return of the aircraft carrier HMS Invincible at the end of that conflict. And you see all the civilian boats that are escorting it in. You see the tugs at the front there with their pumps sending these kind of celebratory jets of water into the air. The hoses, I suppose. That's kind of the exception to the rule. But again, it fits the idea, I suppose, of a war that is kind of sanitized, is at a safe distance. And if you think about the way that we experience it, I suppose it's linked to the fact that, particularly since the 1980s, we have television and satellite television that can broadcast these images in real time from around the world. You get to see war almost live on television, and perhaps that can be associated with the rising public distaste for it. In the Second World War, of course, granted there were cameramen filming things, but those films had to be taken back manually, they had to be edited, they had to pass through a censor, and so I suppose people weren't experiencing war in the raw in the same way that we would expect to do today. So yes, the growing distance then from war and violence in that sense. I suppose the corresponding thing is that there has been, to some extent, a growth in more unorthodox methods of war, like, for example, things like IRA terrorism in the 70s, terrorism associated with Al-Qaeda in the 2000s, for example. So I suppose that's the only flip side, that when people have experienced these kind of violence, it's been as sort of one-off randomized acts rather than the old-fashioned two armies approach. And that, I suppose, in itself perhaps brings a different kind of paranoia about war. Particularly, I'm thinking back to, for example, things like the increases in airline security after the September the 11th bombings. So it does have its effects, but yes, nothing compared to a nuclear war or wholesale armies in the field of yesteryear. Now, what other changes then are particularly prominent here? Well, if we're talking about this principle of liberalisation, then one of these key things is the changing nature of the British population, what we might call the changing face of Britain. Now, traditionally, we can look back and think of certain sort of catalytic events that start to trigger this. I mentioned three here. The arrival of the Empire Windrush, which is generally acknowledged to have been the first ship bringing groups of immigrants from the Caribbean to England. You also have the violence that starts to break out in India after its independence from Britain. And then finally, of course, you have then the violent repressive rule of Chairman Mao in China. So with these countries being destabilized, it triggers waves of migration overseas. And then we see similar things today. For example, the war in Syria triggered a wave of migration into, for example, Eastern Europe. These things, these trends recur through time. I suppose really over the 20 years after that, these events represent the start, but over the sort of 20 years after that, we start to see these trends grow up, with the unfortunate sort of side effect that there is a corresponding force of reaction. There will always be a people in society who resent signs of success in others, and therefore there was indeed violence that comes as a result of this. Most famously, in 1968, a conservative, a relatively minor and probably rather has-been conservative politician called Enoch Powell gave a speech in his constituency in Birmingham, in which he referred back to a speech from the Roman times, in fact, and he talked about how he could only predict violence as a result of immigration that had taken place. And he was absolutely denounced for this, and it ended what was left of his career, because while there were pockets in society clearly that were prepared to look at people from other countries and, as it were, scapegoat them for society's problems. I mean, I mentioned on here things like rising unemployment, for example. While there will always be undesirable people who are prepared to hold those kind of views, it's interesting the fact that when he actually expressed them publicly, it's interesting that he was destroyed for doing so. So I suppose really, in the long run, what that actually demonstrates is more about national tolerance than national division. But you see, for example, if you look at the image there on the right, a skinhead rioter, again, from that sort of period, you see evidence of some of the kinds of violence that took place, a reaction against the positive liberalising influences that we have seen. Obviously, pretty unpleasant looking fellow there. What other trends then can we talk about? Well, the reality is the impact of these things live on. I mean, it's only in 2016 that the poster on the left there was issued by the Leave European Union campaign, as you see there, obviously fronted by Nigel Farage. So in other words, divisive rhetoric based on race and ethnicity, sadly, in spite of everything, still has a part to play. But I suppose it's only consolation that his political career again now is sort of largely over, and I suppose at least it reflects well on us as a nation that his influence is now thankfully diminished. But to bring it right up to date, look at the right-hand side of the screen, and the protests now in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in America. There will always be ill treatment brought about by these sort of negative and reactionary people, but in the end it speaks more positively about the power of the protests that rise up as a result. I suppose we've come a long way towards an equal society, but as these events demonstrate, perhaps slightly more in America even than here, but there is work to be done. Now, to move backwards then slightly in time, we talked about the 1950s and into the 1960s as this time of relative optimism. However, unfortunately, that starts to collapse. One of the reasons why there was a post-war boom is because many, damaged though Britain was, many other countries had suffered worse. But as other countries actually then started to revamp their industries, they then became themselves more competitive, and gradually interest in British manufacturing declines. By the 1960s, many factories were still Victorian, and some were still running on steam power, had not modernised or moved with the times at all, and were no longer competitive. So what you have then really is a very toxic cocktail of falling productivity, less efficiency, and overall attempts were made to improve these things, but a lot of resistance met from the unions. The methods that were employed to improve things not particularly helpful or positive or constructive, and so you have a decade dominated by strikes. You have successive governments on both sides of the political spectrum, Labour and Conservative, struggling to maintain production and productivity and support the national finances. You have many huge national industries of the sort that were founded in the aftermath of Attlee's government in the 1940s, being very inefficiently run, hemorrhaging money, costing the government money to own them, and there's this growing feeling that something is going to have to change. I said that it was a perfect storm because it's not only problems at home, but abroad also. Conflict in the Middle East, internal conflicts leads to things like oil shortages. Petrol prices start to go up very, very rapidly, and in 1974 it becomes so bad that it's announced that the power stations will only be generating electricity on 3 days a week, hence the spring of the 3-day week. It seems unbelievable to us today. I mean, for example, at that time, my parents moved into their first house, and it took them months for things like arranging the delivery of furniture because of petrol rationing, petrol shortages. Simply meant that deliveries could not take place. The country was absolutely on its knees. And so, of course, there's growing discontent. No one likes to see a country struggling in this way. You see there at the bottom centre the evidence of a strike by refuse collectors, rubbish piling up in the streets. At one point in Liverpool, there was a strike of, I think, possibly undertakers, and so the dead were not being buried for weeks and weeks and months on end. And this growing discontent, we see it in various things. We see it in new political parties. The Green Party, for example, has its foundations at this time. The SDP, the Social Democrat Party, which then merged with the Liberals to become the Liberal Democrat Party. People are looking for new outcomes, but opposition crystallises around the figure of Margaret Thatcher, and so at the end of this period, 1979, she is elected with a manifesto to, as it were, get things working again, not without opposition. She was a very divisive figure, as of course I'm sure you will know, but that was the case. Now, I mentioned about discontent, and we sort of see that reflected in the arts as well. I mean, just to look at the picture on the right-hand side there, you've got, second from the right, I think that's Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols. You have punk, this extremely violent, extremely aggressive, extremely disrespectful sort of musical trend. Perhaps motivated at the frustrations with what is actually taking place. And on the extreme right, you have David Bowie. And again, we talked about this trend for escapism. Well, think about that. Think about all his, alter egos, his different identities. The lavish and extravagant costumes. What is that but an attempt to get out of a decade that is increasingly grey and drab and concerning for many people? But yes, the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, it really triggers the beginning of the end for many aspects of this post-war consensus. Now, there are a number of things that she does to try and kickstart the economy. Now, the famous thing is things like shutting many of the old mines, which she considered, not without reason, to be unprofitable and no longer workable. And so she is associated with that and with lots of unemployment and striking, particularly early in her time. However, what she also did was to really liberalise the laws which governed the trade in the financial markets in London. And what that then does is that's the point at which the British stock market becomes such a prominent one in the world. So there's a huge rise in trading in London, which generates enormous amounts of money in tax. That was an example of a positive impact of something that the government did. The discovery of North Sea oil is just a kind of hitting the jackpot, and no one can say that Thatcher wasn't lucky, because again, the enormous taxes that were raised on oil put enormous amounts of money back into the treasury, and actually the public finances by 1991 at the end of Thatcher's time were actually better than they have been really probably at any point in the 20th century. Certainly the national debt was down to something like 15% of GDP, of the country's annual income. By comparison now, it's back up to something like 95%. So really did have a very positive impact on the national finances. However, unfortunately, the freedoms that were created did not always have particularly positive effects. You see the picture of the 1980s stock trader there, and in a sense, the stock trader becomes a kind of poster boy for the 1980s. This idea that suddenly greed and a desire to earn money is something to be admired. And if you look at the top right here, you see a character known as Loads of Money, who was created by Harry Enfield, the impressionist and sort of comic actor. And the whole joke was that he was a plasterer, but that he was this sort of really grasping character. He fleeced all his customers, and he was always on stage, as you see there, waving a big wad of cash and shouting loads of money. And so the idea was that actually this greed that had been created perhaps wasn't entirely a good thing. Other kind of prominent trends that you sort of see, liberalisation of trading laws and a boom in consumer spending. Earlier in this period, there'd been increased access to kind of credit for ordinary people, so that ordinary people could access loans and buy, not necessarily having to buy things outright, but could pay for it over time. So people are buying much more. In the case of things like that, you have the importation of the idea of shopping centres from America, so that people can access all their shops in one place without having to walk around a nasty wet town centre, which again boosts footfall on shopping streets, boosts numbers, and this all raises money as well. And the other archetypal creation of the 80s was something called the yuppie, the young urban professional, YUP, the yuppie. And you see this helpful diagram here, and in some ways it's almost a little bit like a kind of a take on the kind of modern hipster in a way. But it's all this emphasis on things, the Burberry coat, the Gucci briefcase, the Ralph Lauren suit. This new kind of urban class that is affluent, that is interested in things and labels and consumerism and shopping and all that sort of thing. And it's seen as being a kind of a creation of the Thatcher boom that took place in probably the last sort of half of her time in office. The only other problem, of course, is that because of the increased freedoms that people were given, the decline in state control, lots of the nationalised industries, like gas, for example, and telecom, were sold off by Margaret Thatcher. And so it led to a reduction in state control, an increase in freedoms, but the trouble with increased freedoms is that people are free to do with them what they wish. And as the loads of money stereotype demonstrates, not everyone was particularly happy with the way that the world was going. And so at the beginning of the 1990s, when John Major was the Prime Minister, he attempted to create, probably for the last time really, a genuinely conservative vision of what the country could be like, and what he hoped that perhaps we could get back to. And if you look at his speech in the black box here, he said, it's a time to return to these core values, to get back to basics. And back to basics was what the media latched on as the name for this. He talked about self-discipline, respect for the law, consideration for others, accepting responsibility for yourself and your family, and not shuffling it off on other people and the state. He went on further, and he, in the note at the top there, he talked about in the speech in which he launched this in 1993, and he talked about a vision of England as a country of long shadows on county cricket grounds, warm beer, green suburbs, dog lovers, and old maids bicycling to Holy Communion through the morning mist. Now, frankly, this is a vision of England that probably sounded out of date in the 1930s, but what he was attempting to kind of achieve, he thought that he needed to sort of roll back some of the um, excesses from the 1980s period. Unfortunately, he was doomed, not least because um, all his attempts at gentility um, counted for nothing, because he had a cabinet who were particularly indisciplined when it came to personal scandals. Now, the most famous one you see here was a character called, I think, David Mellor, who was one of his ministers. And the Sun published a picture suggesting not merely that he, and I quote from the headline there, scored 4 times with this actress, but apparently that he used to like to do so whilst wearing his Chelsea football kit. These ridiculous scandals, I think some of which actually were turned out after the fact not to have been true, but the trouble was people were so cynical by this time that they were quite willing to believe that it had happened. Yes, 2 excellent headlines there, obviously, as you see. The toe job one referencing apparently to another of his peccadillos. But the point is that really, in a sense, the world has sort of changed. You couldn't simply go back to this kind of nostalgic Britain. It just didn't exist. By 1997, Major's government is out, and we have Tony Blair coming in as Prime Minister, a man who, in many ways, encapsulated much more, I think, about the finger on the pulse. Throughout the 1990s, John Major was the one who looked tired and grey and like a figure from the past, and Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, who liked to be pictured with a mug of coffee, or very often holding a guitar to show what a cool man he was. He seemed to be the one who had more of a finger on the pulse. And if you think back to the big thing that in the late 90s, Cool Britannia, Britpop, Oasis and Blur, the Spice Girls, this was the way that the country was going. It was very much going forward, not backward. You couldn't really put that genie back in the bottle. So throughout this period, there's all sorts of different things then that happen. Now, if we think about urbanism then, our attitude towards where we live, towards our towns and cities. Now, at the beginning of this period, as that image on the top left there demonstrates, many people still, in spite of attempts before the Second World War, many people still living in slums or very unsanitary conditions, only exacerbated by wartime, many people living next to bomb sites, to empty lots created by bomb damage and so on, living in terrible conditions. And what the other 2 black and white pictures there demonstrate are some of the directions that went in. Now, on the top there, you have another picture of a new council estate. And this idea of a new suburbia, the same kind of developments that had been happening before the war for more wealthy people to buy houses themselves, the idea was to build something a little similar but for ordinary people. And at this time, council housing was actually remarkably common. It was something that was done. It was a lifestyle choice essentially. So it was done by large swathes of society as a very normal thing to do. And again, both my parents are actually classic examples at this time, because both my parents were born when their parents, i.e. my grandparents, were living at home due to housing shortages, but within very short times of both their births, both my parents moved into council houses, which was very much the thing to do. That was one sort of arm of our view, but the other thing was there was also an attempt to rejuvenate our cities. Up to this point, cities had been seen as places of slums and of sort of dirt and soot and grime, and poverty. Hence the move towards suburbs. People wanted to get away from that, but there was a move to create cities of the future. Now the picture here is of the Trellick Tower, which was an early council flat tower built in London by the architect Erno Goldfinger, who bizarrely enough was a friend of Ian Fleming and gave his name, or rather lent his name, to the Bond villain Goldfinger. But there was an attempt to build these beautiful buildings, and as this contemporary picture demonstrates, they really were seen as being things of the future. You think back to the Jetsons, for example, the cartoon I showed you earlier. There was a real view to actually create these things. Now, lots of problems have happened to these things since. Many of these council blocks were built with very poor building standards. Many of them suffered from, some of them certainly suffered from things like structural collapse. They were notoriously badly insulated. They were cold and drafty because of the high winds at high altitudes. And lots of them within sort of 30 years were torn down again. And there's a sense that that kind of urban living became rather discredited. And it's only really probably 50 years later, if you look at the top right, that there's been a new attempt to build high quality urban housing. And as a whole, England or Britain does not have a particularly strong relationship with this kind of thing. And very much, as the picture at the bottom there demonstrates, the aspirational thing in this country is still mainly to live in a kind of house in the suburbs with a driveway and a garden. That seems to be what most people aspire towards. There are living in cities is seen as being a young person's thing. It's been something that you do as a phase, but not necessarily as a life, as television programs like Escape to the Country rather demonstrate, in that there are not merely lots of older people who have this idea of moving out to a more peaceful life, but huge numbers of sort of perhaps 30 and 40 something professionals who have this idea of moving their family into some kind of more perceivedly idyllic rural environment. And I suppose in a funny sort of way, perhaps maybe John Major had something after all. Maybe there are people who do hark back to these kind of older visions of England, but these are just some of the tensions then that we play with. Now, once again, we'll pause this here and we'll resume in the next video. So I thank you for your attention, and I will speak to you again shortly.